Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is the golden age of American Jews ending? Thank you to our very special guest, Franklin Foer, author, national correspondent of The Atlantic, and former editor of The New Republic. Professor Pamela Nadell, professor and chair in Women and Gender History at the American University and director of the Jewish Studies program. And Professor Leonard Saxe, professor of contemporary Jewish studies and director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute at Brandeis University. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. The cover story of the April 2024 issue of The Atlantic made a dramatic claim that has touched off who knows how many debates and arguments, public and private. The golden age of American Jews is ending. That's the judgment of Franklin Foer, staff writer for The Atlantic and also author of the recently published biography of Joe Biden called The Last Politician. Franklin Foer's article cites the successes of American Jews in entertainment, literature, government, business, science, especially in the years after World War II, when anti-Semitism subsided. And he contrasts that experience with recent outbursts of anti-Semitism. From the right, conspiracy theories that demonize George Soros, sometimes Jewish space lasers. From the left, attacks on Israel that often bleed into demonization of Zionism, Jewish support for Israel, and sometimes the demonization of Jews in general. In this hour, is the golden age of American Jews ending? We'll hear from Franklin Foer and also from two scholars of the American Jewish community, Professors Pamela Nadell of American University and Len Saxe of Brandeis. First, though, to Franklin Foer, who is on the road and joins us from Tel Aviv. Hi, Frank. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for having me.
There are two premises to your article. First, that this has been a golden age for American Jews, and second, that it's ending. So let's take the first one first. What makes the last decades of the 20th century, or more than that, a golden age for American Jews?
So, headed out of World War II, it was hard to conjure what American Jewish life was like in the 1940s, given that there were quotas that kept Jews out of universities, there were housing restrictions, there was a Protestant monopoly in this country that limited the ability of Jews to achieve success. And then in the aftermath of the Holocaust and in the early days of the Cold War, and for a whole variety of reasons, Jews were not just able to enter into the mainstream of American life, they were embraced by this country in a way that felt completely unprecedented in the history of the diaspora, that Jews weren't just accepted, they weren't just tolerated, they played this role in constructing what American life looked like, from our politics, where there was a Jewish vision of liberalism that Jews helped to install in the country as a consensus, to the novel, where the great Jewish novel was was the great American novel for a period to entertainment. When I was growing up in the 1990s, Seinfeld, which was essentially a Jewish show, was the most watched show on television. You had the Adam Sandler song about Hanukkah, which every Gentile knew the words to, and I could go on. And what made this distinctive was not just the comparison to what came before, but the other Jewish experiences throughout global history.
Now, you write, over the 20th century, Jews invested their faith in a distinct strain of liberalism that combined robust civil liberties, the protection of minority rights, and an ethos of cultural pluralism. It was good for America and good for the Jews. So let's agree that MAGA Republicans and left-wing students, at least at this period of their lives, reject that kind of liberalism. Doesn't that still leave a lot of Americans who don't reject it?
Without a doubt. I mean, it's not, the end of a golden age in Auschwitz are not the same thing. Just because we're not at the zenith that I just described that prevailed for so much of the post-war period doesn't mean that we're headed to some sort of catastrophe. But what it does mean is that when you go back to the 1990s, there was this sense that anti-Semitism had essentially faded from American life, that liberal democracy was strong. And we've seen that both of those two things, both of those two faiths have essentially eroded. So you have this, as democracy has weakened, it turns out that the Jewish theory of American life was correct, that when you don't have the structures of this liberalism that helped fuel the golden age, then you do have this resurgence of anti-Semitism that's happened. And it doesn't mean that anti-Semitism will be the dominant fact of American life. Necessarily. It does not mean that Jews will cease to be prosperous or protected by the state. But it does mean that there's an understandable resurgence of Jewish anxiety that's happening in our country right now. That's not just an imagined state of fervor that people have. It's real. And then when you stitch together everything that's transpired over the course of this century, starting with 9/11, continuing through the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the rise of Donald Trump, the collapse of the broad consensus around Israel, the surge of this new left and new identity politics, it's made Jewish life in this country more uncomfortable than it was 20 years ago.
You mentioned the great Jewish American novelists in the period after World War II, Bellow and Mailer and Roth and Irwin Shaw, and we could go on with many more. And it seemed to me, I thought about that a lot, and it seemed to me that those writers were, for the most part, describing in their fiction, they were describing this bridge from the immigrant experience into the assimilated experience that the Second World War created by mixing all these people together. And there's still a lot of good novelists around, but those writers told a story that resonated with lots of people who weren't Jewish because it was also their story. That from the way I see it, it culminated, I think, of somehow John F. Kennedy's election being of a piece with the Jewish novelists, and that they both broke the very monopoly, the Protestant monopoly that you've spoken of.
That's right. And I think one of the things that I reflect on when I look back at a lot of those what are now canonical texts from the golden age of American Judaism, one of the things that you realize is that the tension that fueled a lot of those novels was the tension of this story of rising up from the confines of the ghetto, or whatever we want to call pre-assimilated Jewish life, entering into the mainstream, and all of the tensions that resulted. And so, I mean, this is, I don't want to pivot to optimism too quickly, but
you can't because we have another 50 minutes to go. Yes.
Right. But one of the things I think about as emerging in this different age that we're entering into is that Jewish life had become quite comfortable for an extended period of time. And, one of the reasons why the golden age doesn't exist are not just external reasons, there are certain internal reasons too. And there's a certain amount of, in bad times, there's a certain amount of productive energy that emerges, whether it's spiritual energy in the ways in which, after the disappointments of 1967, when the left turned on Israel the first time, you had the rise of the Havarah movement, you had the Jewish catalog, you had all these things that were born out of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have a certain amount of discomfort that exists now that will also prove to be creative kindling for the next set of great Jewish novelists. That tension sometimes is a salutary thing,
Yes.
even if it is deeply uncomfortable.
Your article in The Atlantic both made mention of and even included a photo of Martin Luther King holding up a picture of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi, one Black, the other 2 Jewish. How much of the current Jewish anxiety over our place in American life and in a liberal society, how much of it involves a loss of a special relationship with African Americans?
I mean, without a doubt that's part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I think it would be a mistake to think that is, the whole story. I hear a lot of people, I hear a lot of Jews say that DEI is the great enemy. And without a doubt, the DEI movement, diversity, equity, inclusion movement, has excesses, the ways in which it has no space for understanding, analyzing, redressing anti-Semitism. All of that is problematic. Some parts of its attack on ideas of meritocracy that Jews had flourished under, like, those are excesses that I think need to be corrected. But I think that it's a mistake that Jews make to assume that is the sole issue that's stoking this rise of anti-Semitism. And I think there's a possibility that there's a dangerous tendency within the organized Jewish world and among Jews to look at this moment and to where there's so much fear and anxiety, and to run away from a lot of the historic tenets of Jewish liberalism, to run in the protection of the strong man, or to run in the protection of towards the right. And I think that if we make that collective choice, or individually we make that choice, there is a risk of making problems a whole lot worse on a whole lot of other fronts.
Frank, I want you to stay with us because we'll have a question and answer period in about 15 minutes. But thank you very much for that interview. Our second panelist is Pamela Nadell. She's professor of Jewish history at American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Nadell's research has focused on the role of Jewish women in shaping American history and American Jewish history. In 2019, her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year Award. Professor Pamela Nadell, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
A couple of years ago, you debated this very question, is the golden age of American Jews ending, with Bret Stephens of the New York Times at the 92nd Street Y in New York. And you were, I think that's where it was, or do I have that wrong?
We were actually at the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum.
Excuse me. And you were very emphatic that the strength of the Jewish community, Jewish organizations, the role that American Jewish women now play in synagogue life, Jewish population growth, all make the idea of the end of a Jewish golden age wrong. Have the events since October changed your mind at all about that?
Certainly I'm very disturbed, obviously, by the extent of the events and the protests on campus and, frankly, all over the world, not just in the United States, since October 7th, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not convinced that the golden age of American Jewry is ending. I think the issue is that, and I think I'm writing a book called Anti-Semitism in American Tradition, a history right now, is that we have not always understood the way in which anti-Semitism has been a really bright thread coursing across the American Jewish experience, even in the years that we're talking about as the golden age. So Frank was just talking about some of my favorite novelists, but he wasn't talking about the bombs that exploded in Southern synagogues, and not only in Atlantis Temple in 1958, in the very years that those novelists were writing.
One test of where we stand in America is, as Jews at least, is does a Jew whose attire or whose Jewish star pendant identifies him or her as Jewish risk harassment or humiliation in America today in a way that his or her grandparents did not face the threat of harassment or humiliation? And what's the answer to that question?
Well, the answer is obviously yes. I mean, we know that from some of the survey questions that have been coming out now, we know that people are hiding their Jewish identity. Some are wearing it with a great deal of pride, but others are being told, don't wear a Jewish star, watch where you are if you're wearing things that are, may identify one as a Jew. But your comment about their grandparents not facing that, they may not have faced attacks because honestly, most Jewish men did not wear a yarmulke when they went out or kippah when they went out in earlier periods. But again, there were these other very serious incidents, and they actually emerge. The high tide of American anti-Semitism has traditionally been called the years between World War I and World War II. But we also know that it really surges immediately even after the war, because a lot of those fascist groups, the pro-Nazi groups, had been shut down when the United States entered the war. And then they're free to say whatever they want once the war is over and they're not subject to charges of sedition. So we've had trouble before.
But the first period of anti-Semitism was also a time when, I mean, one thing that President Wilson and former President Theodore Roosevelt agreed about was that anybody who described him or herself as a hyphenated American of any kind carried the hyphen was a dagger they carried in their name. There's only one loyalty you have, it's to the U.S., and that made things uncomfortable for not just Jews but for a lot of Irish and for German Americans who'd been here for some time.
Frank talks about this in his article because he writes about Horace Cowan, and Horace Cowan, who has given us the antecedents of what we would call some kind of ethnic pluralism. He was talking about cultural pluralism. He used the metaphor of the salad bowl. He was writing in the 19-teens when Wilson was in office. And I think the notion of the embrace of hyphenated Americans, that idea really comes forward in the wake of the civil rights movement. It's we see the surge in terms of what we call white ethnic identities in the 1960s. And that's what allows the Jews to also embrace their ethnic identities in ways they hadn't done before, with things like, as Frank just said, like the Jewish catalog.
When we spoke before our panel here, you told me something very interesting about the whole idea of golden ages being declared. That historiographers have a way of finding golden ages at certain times.
Right. So I actually started to look at that when I was asked to debate Bret Stephens a couple of years ago. And I should tell you, I was assigned the optimistic view, and he got the other side, but I could have argued his side as well, right, just so you know. Yeah. But the reality is that we see golden ages being proclaimed when the disquietude of our own moment makes us look back and to earlier periods that we imagine were idyllic. And so the classic example, of course, is the notion of the Golden Age of Spain, and its great exponent was Moses Maimonides. But what nobody ever bothers to remember is that Maimonides had to flee his birthplace of Cordova and wander across Spain and North Africa for a decade because of persecutions.
Yes, I remember being taught about the Golden Age of Moorish Spain, and years later reading Yehuda Halevi, who in Sailing East talked about escaping the Arab yoke. So clearly it wasn't all peaches and cream in Moorish Spain. To what degree have social media, the internet generally, simply circulated and exposed ideas that have been out there all along, that have always been confined to the sidelines of American politics, at least not always, but since the rise of the civil rights movement, let's say, and now are suddenly being exposed to many more people.
Right. Social media is in terms of the expression of all forms of hate, not just of anti-Semitism,
Mhm.
is really horrifying. And what we don't tend to remember is that earlier figures have used the media of their day, the new media of their day, to espouse anti-Semitism. So Henry Ford publishes a 91-week series in the 1920s in a newspaper that he bought. And Father Charles Coughlin, he's all over the radio, and he may have been a Catholic priest, but estimates are that about a quarter of Americans would listen to his Sunday broadcasts. And so today, social media is the current tool for expressing anti-Semitism. And of course, in many ways, it is so much worse than those earlier ones.
Well, Professor Nadell, stick with us because in about 10 minutes, we'll have our Q&A session. But thanks for being with us today. Our third panelist is Professor Len Saxe. Professor Saxe is a social psychologist at Brandeis University. He directs a network of research centers and initiatives there that focus on contemporary Jewry, mostly in the US, but also in Israel and elsewhere. Len Saxe, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me.
You have studied Jewish group identity for many years. How would you describe the mood of pessimism implicit in Franklin Foer's article about a golden age ending now?
I think the interesting thing about being Jewish is that we hold these conflicting ideas, and we can hold multiple conflicting ideas and consider them all as true. During what Frank describes as the golden era, there was a discussion in the Jewish community dominated by this notion of the vanishing American Jew. 1963 Look magazine article, an eponymous book in the 1990s. And the fear was of assimilation, people becoming American by marrying non-Jewish spouses. Predictions were that by 2020, there would only be Orthodox Jews, no progressive Jews. Israel was thought to be off the map when Birthright Israel was started in 1999, and 25 years later, close to 500,000 North American young Jews have participated in it. So that's a long-standing story.
I'd like you to talk about some data that you and your colleagues have produced that says something about the place of Jews in American life and intermarried couples that involve a Jew in American life. You found that American Jews number about 8 million, almost 8 million, which is a couple of million more than other estimates. Who are the 2 million Jews that you would say should be counted and aren't counted by others?
Well, what's happened is that when you ask people the straight question, excuse me, what, if any, is your religion? There are many Jews, or some Jews, who say, I'm not a religious Jew. But if you ask them as a follow-up question, do you consider yourself Jewish? Do you have a Jewish parent? Do you have a Jewish education? Are you engaged in Jewish life? Very often they will say so. So we use a definition of who is Jewish that is now accepted by communities across the United States and was used by the Pew Research Center in their 2013-2020 studies.
So what you're describing though is quite remarkable in that I think there's an 80% rate of non-Orthodox Jews marrying non-Jews, and that doesn't mean automatically that the children are going to cease being Jewish. This is a
yes, that's what was not predicted. And talk about predictions in the 60s and 70s and 1990 American Jewish population study. Everybody thought that intermarriage was the end of the line for Jewish families, for Jewish identities. And quite the opposite happened. The children of these intermarried families, the vast majority of them, when they became adults, this is starting with the generation born in 1981, they identify with being Jewish.
What does Donald Trump and his MAGA movement How does it fit in this picture, if at all, for you?
Well, I think, and I don't know where the line is.
We should add that one thing that is remarkable about Donald Trump is that he has Jewish grandchildren. His daughter is married to an observant Jew. Yes.
Yeah, my psychological sense is that he is narcissistic and looking out for himself and will say whatever he needs to say. I think I regard what he says and does as very dangerous, really tearing at the fabric of American life, and I think that has consequences not just for Jews; it has consequences for everybody. If I can just go back for a second, now you mentioned President Wilson, and it's really interesting. Recently, I assigned to my class I'm teaching 2 essays of Louis Brandeis, the namesake of my university, written the end of June, beginning of July, 1915, before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Beautiful essays. And one of the things that he came to understand is that the melting pot notion was not necessarily what was going to take America into greatness. And so he emphasized the fact that we need to be a mosaic. We need to be a country where each immigrant group can preserve their languages, their customs, their foods. But this mosaic, we share a set of values that make us one. And one of the interesting things about Wilson is, despite his disagreement with Brandeis on a whole bunch of issues, pointed him to the Supreme Court over the objection of many.
Yes. You've said that crises in Jewish history have often led to creative responses. Is this a crisis in Jewish history right now? And do you see any creative responses being articulated out there?
I think this is a crisis in Jewish history. I was talking about the essay of Shimon Rabidovich, who founded Jewish studies at Brandeis in 1950-51, the ever-dying people, where essentially he said, in every generation, it was his claim, Jews have thought that they were going to turn out the lights, that this was going to be the end of Jewish life, and that for him, the secret sauce of Jewish perseverance, the continuity of Judaism over millennia, was our anxiety about disappearing, that led to creative ways of responding to the world.
Len Saxe of Brandeis, thank you, and stick with us. I'd like to bring back Pamela, Nadell, and Franklin Foer. Starting with Frank Foer, just any comments you have about what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
I quite agree with, I think, everything they said. I should say that I spoke to Len Saxe at great length and relied on his research to inform a lot of my conclusions. And one of the powerful things that he has at his disposal is comparative data. And especially in trying to make sense of what's happening on college campuses, he's got data studying the attitudes and responses of Jewish kids who've gone on Birthright Israel, which happens to be, I don't want to speak for him because he knows, but he powerfully shows that there has been a very measurable change. Doesn't happen everywhere, but there has been a very much measurable change in the way that Jewish students experience anti-Semitism on campus, and that helped me kind of really take seriously what was happening on campus. I just want to say one thing that, and I agree with Pamela's historical analysis, that anti-Semitism, we may have wished that it had disappeared, but it never fully disappeared, and it's always been with us. When I started working on this piece, it was really actually about a year and a half ago. I started thinking I wanted to do something significant about anti-Semitism, because I had a conversation with my brother, who's far more observant than I am, and we had a conversation. I said, in America, in my lifetime, I've never actually experienced anti-Semitism myself. And I struggled, I knew it was out there in the world, but I struggled to connect with it as a phenomenon, because he wears a kippah on Shabbat, and he's got kids who are immersed in a more observant community than I am. He said, "Let me tell you, when I was walking down the street in Brookline, my family was followed by a guy who muttered Trump, Trump, Trump under his breath, and we had to run into the store. My in-laws Stiebel in Westchester was shot up with a BB gun. My son's best friend is the son of a Hasidic rabbi, and his house was burnt down in what police determined to be a hate crime." And after hearing him describe that, it was the kind of anecdotal equivalent of shaking me by the lapel and thinking I had to do something about the resurgence of anti-Semitism because I wasn't taking it seriously enough myself. And then I started processing and thinking and reading, and journalism being journalism, I would get distracted by whatever the shiny object was or whatever the news of the day was. And then October 7th happened, and I felt like I couldn't write about anything other than this, given what I was witnessing in so many aspects of American life. And I think part of what happens to us as individuals, we live in this hyper-polarized world where our brains tend to shut down when we see something happening on our own side of the political spectrum. And as somebody who identifies as a liberal person, I realized that I had underestimated certain aspects of left-wing anti-Semitism that had suddenly become impossible to deny. And I wanted to make sense of the entire phenomenon, not just as stitching it together in its whole, not just looking at its component parts. I think as is our natural tendency as human beings to just compartmentalize Trump or campus anti-Semitism, but to look at them as a whole.
Well said. And Pamela, Nadell, thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
First of all, it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with both Frank and with Len. And I agree very much with what Frank just said about how important Len's research is, because his comparative data that show us how attitudes that on college campuses, how students' attitudes have changed. And that's what's really, really critical, is to have this comparative data from even just a few years ago so that we can see the rising levels of anxiety, which are unquestionably justified. What jumps out at me is how, because we don't know the past, the kind of attacks that Frank's describing that his brother faced in Brookline, that these are actually continuities with the American Jewish experience rather than discontinuities. And that if we just had a better sense of what had happened in the past, we would understand that. So Frank was absolutely right. What ushers in the feeling of the golden age is that the quotas fall, the restrictive covenants fall, the restrictions on hotels fall. And it also becomes, frankly, in certain social circles, completely unfashionable to voice anti-Semitism. And that happens by the 60s. But at the same time that's happening, it also becomes fashionable in other circles, both on the left and the right, to embrace these old conspiracy theories.
Len, Saxe, thoughts? And
just a quick thought. First of all, my appreciation to both Frank and Pam to being in this conversation. I have this metaphor about anti-Semitism. It is a virus. We thought it was dormant for a while, and it's now mutated and is being expressed in a different way. And the expression of anti-Semitism is linked to Israel and what Israelis and Israel is believed to be doing. And what I find distressing about our response to it is that so many people think that all we need to do is just tell people that it's bad to be anti-Semitic or that anti-Semitism is rampant, and that will stop it. We need to figure out what are the actual causes. We're not spending enough time on that. Is it really that there's a coherent narrative amongst college students about Israel and what it's doing, the settler colonial narrative, another one called the anti-hierarchical aggression hypothesis, that it's all about Jews are people of privilege and people of privilege oppress the non-privileged? Or is it just social networking? Is it just you're doing it because you're going along? We haven't spent enough time trying to figure this out. That's what we need to do.
Okay. Here's a question from viewer Elaine Langer, who writes, and this is Frank Foer, you were talking about this attitude. Why is Donald Trump always mentioned as a major cause of civil strife, but Democrats, progressives, and the leftist professors who control our college campuses increasingly K through 12 education in this country, and she goes on to mention critical race theory and DEA, that all of this is anathema to the American ideals of success through hard work and merit? Why don't we talk more about that? So what is the answer, Frank? You said people shouldn't do that, but what do you say to Elaine Langer? Say,
I'm not. There in what she described, there's clear elements of what I consider to be hard truths about the ways in which progressivism have taken wrong turns, and I think that those deserve to be critiqued and the like. But I would also say that, at least from my perspective, I can't deny that Donald Trump didn't play a significant role. So in my view, left and right-wing anti-Semitism shouldn't be disconnected as phenomena. That what's happened, and to use the metaphor that Len invoked, which is if anti-Semitism is a virus and it was laying dormant, we need to reconsider the way in which it was escaped from the lab, or it started to spread wildly through American society. And I think in my analysis, what you see is both the left and the right, even though their fixations are different, even though their analyses of society are different, they conspire to take something that had been verboten and taboo, as Pamela said, that was in lots of parts of polite society, you couldn't talk about Jews in a certain way. And then suddenly you have Donald Trump kind of giving his big wink to the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville saying Jews won't replace us. You have right-wing conspiracies that put a Jewish puppet master at the center of the narrative. And you have figures like Elon Musk, who took one of the world's most important global platforms and said, come back in, Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites. And the president of the United States, the former president of the United States, has dinner with the nation's leading Holocaust denier. I mean, I can't say that hasn't played a role in stoking what we see, and that it's once the latch gets lifted in this, I'm mixing so many metaphors here, the genie that was once stuffed in the bottle comes out, it becomes very, very hard to put it back in.
Okay, here's a question from, it says from Charles's iPad. I assume that's not his name. Do you anticipate a reimagined synagogue playing an even more important role going forward? Len Saxe, do you want to answer that?
I don't know if synagogues are up to the task. I don't know if liberal synagogues in particular are up to the task. They're not doing as badly as some people think. The proportion of households that are members of synagogues is actually the same or higher than it was in previous eras, even during the golden age. And given the larger population base, there are actually more people who are affiliated. But whether synagogues and Judaism as a set of religious practices and beliefs will grow, that's hard to say at this moment.
Here's a question that I'll put to you, Pamela Nadell. Randall writes, anti-Semitism is often just taken as a reality. I've never heard a convincing explanation for what causes it and why it has persisted over millennia. Any thoughts on this? I have some of my own ideas. The usual means of combating anti-Semitism have seemed very ineffective. Perhaps this is related to not having a good theory as to what causes it. So what Not that one cause has always been the cause of anti-Semitism, but how do you answer that question?
There are certain anti-Semitic ideas that have been around for thousands of years. And the first one starts with that the Jews murdered Jesus, that it was their fault that Jesus was crucified. And this plays, it's actually, I think, impossible to minimize how powerful that idea remains. Some of you may remember that, and in fact, Frank was just referring to or perhaps Kanye West and how he had espoused anti-Semitism on social media platforms. And there's a group known as the Cohen Defense League, and they ran with that. They hung a banner out over Highway 405 in California. And on that banner, they said, honk if you agree with Kanye. But what almost nobody paid attention to was the last segment of that banner, which, by the way, was actually blurred out in some news reports. It actually said John, and it had chapter and verse, and it said Rev, standing for Revelation, and it had chapter and verse. And if you know your New Testament, those references were to the Jews worshiping in the synagogue of Satan, and that their father was the devil. So there are many ways to answer this question, but that's where I'd start.
So originally, it's the deicide charge. The Jews killed the Son of God. Of course, the Reverend Arthur Hertzberg, I remember reading, I thought very insightfully, about how the Enlightenment, that anti-Semitism was a byproduct of the Enlightenment, and that Voltaire's attitude of what would make a real European had no room for the Jew. It had room for the lapsed Catholic, but not the Jew. You mentioned Kanye, or Ye, I guess we're supposed to say, and I wanted to ask Frank Foer about this. You remark on something which I tuned in to watch with great curiosity when Dave Chappelle, stand-up comic, hosted Saturday Night Live, just as Kanye West had been deprived of his sneaker model, whatever, and he did a stand-up routine about taking on the allegation of anti-Semitism, and his treatment of it was rather sly. And I'm curious what you made of that.
Right. In this, it's the cold open to Saturday Night Live, so pretty significant audience, and he talks about how you can't talk about certain people who have too much power, and he's not going to criticize them, and it's all very wink wink, and it's done in this context that, because of whatever we want to call it, wokeism, the new censoriousness, this feeling that there are all these restrictions on free speech, you have people who style themselves as transgressive, who are pushing up against what they perceive to be these new boundaries. And the way that they push up against those new boundaries is by saying the thing that's forbidden, which is, in their mind, the safest thing that's forbidden that you can get away with saying is the anti-Semitic sort of thing. And I think Elon Musk, in my mind, falls into this sort of category when he jokes around on Twitter. He says he bought Twitter, or X, if we're going to be in the rebranding mode, in order to save free speech. And he frequently repeats anti-Semitic memes or makes jokes that have kind of somehow the Jews are at the expense of the joke. And Sartre, other people have pointed out that this type of irony, this type of clownishness is always part of the way that anti-Semitism works, because either when you're charged with anti-Semitism, you can say, it was just a joke. Why are you taking it so seriously? Mm-hmm. Or if somebody laughs at the joke, they're suddenly complicit in your anti-Semitism, and you know that you've reeled them in.
And it may figure here as well that Jews have been known to make jokes about being Jewish, exactly. and therefore that can be used as a kind of validation for that. Len Saxe, when I told someone we'd be talking about Frank's Atlantic article, he didn't. This fellow I spoke with, who's not Jewish, didn't challenge the thesis, but he did say, "Well, what about the end of the golden age of liberals, women, gays, any other group that's caught up in our politics today and seeing their freedoms potentially curtailed, if not in the case of women's reproductive health actually curtailed. Are we just the canaries in the mine shaft here?
I believe we are. It is a puzzle to me. I dedicated my life to studying human social behavior. And I would ask Pam this question. I don't understand why women on college campuses haven't risen up in opposition to what the Supreme Court and state legislatures are doing, and other groups as well that Jews have championed. So for me, I'm as puzzled as well. I think Jews are, because we are a small group where a little bit of organizing against Jews and using the traditional tropes about Jews and power, Jews and money, Jews only liking themselves. They've used Israel as the case for that. And it is now out of control on college campuses.
Pam, Nadell, what did you think about that?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Len. I never thought that I would live in a country where anti-Semitism would be so manifest. I never thought that I would live in a country after, Roe v. Wade, where the right to control one's reproductive life would be denied to so many women, even at the risk of their own lives. So I am completely shocked, and I do not understand why there is not some kind of massive movement against that, rising against that.
So let's talk a little bit about what should be the stance of the American Jewish community. I mean, it's not that there is a single community that can do anything, but of American Jews more broadly, to the current challenge of either more anti-Semitism or more anti-Semitism being expressed. What should we be doing? I mean, frankly, you did enough in describing it. You didn't have to. Your assignment wasn't to solve the problem as well. But what do you think? What should be done in response to that?
Well, they describe with books the last chapter problem is that you write 9 chapters decrying something, and the publisher says, "Hey, you have to stick in a prescriptive chapter," and they're always the least satisfying chapters in a book. And so I have thought about this now somewhat, and I've done a lot of talking to leadership in the Jewish community. And I think one thing that it makes it very hard for us is that we're not the Catholic Church. We don't have a pope. We have, we have a very decentralized network of organizations, and which makes it very hard to do some of the things that I think probably would be important steps for us to take as a people in order to navigate what we're facing. So for starters, I think we would need to have a generational strategy for navigating what I would call post-liberal America. And there would be several components to it. I mean, among them, I think a lot of American Jews are going to just walk away from Israel. I mean, that's going to, especially younger Jews, when they see that there's a social cost to be paid for identifying as a Zionist. And I'm sitting here in Tel Aviv right now, and to me, an incredibly lovable city with an incredibly lovable culture and an incredibly lovable people. And for some reason, that's failed. Despite Birthright Israel, which has been successful in many sort of ways, connecting with a broader culture, and even we have to concede that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement had the goal of delegitimizing Israel on college campuses and in certain left-wing communities. And you have to say that they've not entirely succeeded, but they've succeeded, I think, beyond most people's expectations. And that what's needed is a multi-generational strategy that kind of transcends this conflict for trying to re-legitimize Israel among broad sectors of the American public. And as I've thought about this, I've thought about how the United States waged the cultural Cold War against communism, and how what the United States did very successfully during that period, where communism was encroaching into places like Italy and France that we knew we needed to preserve. We were willing to look for allies among people who weren't necessarily people who agreed with everything that we thought, and we were willing to find mouthpieces for them and bully pulpits for them in order to. And there was this strategy of finding ways to sell the American idea to people who weren't necessarily receptive to every aspect of the American system, whether it was through jazz or through literature or whatnot. My point is that that's one part of the strategy. Then the other part, I don't want to filibuster here, but I think Len said what I truly believe, which is that the plight of American democracy and the health of American Jewry are intimately connected. And I think about all the ways in which democracy is decaying, and kind of what can we do as a community to help bolster it? You know, why aren't synagogues like enlisting poll workers from our ranks? I mean, they're just to give an example of ways in which we could model civic behavior. I think there's certain ways in which civil discourse has declined, in which we unintentionally end up contributing to that. And there are ways in which we can model healthy liberal discourse that we want to see in the rest of the population. And so I'm just throwing ideas at you. I think it takes a lot more thought than I've put into it, but I'm worried that we're not putting the thought into it as a people.
Oh, some good ideas. Pam Nadell, but throw some things against the wall.
So first of all, I really agree with what Frank just said. You're absolutely on target. The problem is that right now I feel like the Jewish community is playing whack-a-mole. Just keeps hitting, something that comes up. And the problem is that the ideas that we need to respond to this, just as this happened in the past, are going to take a long time to develop. So what I tend to think of is the way that the film Exodus and the novel Exodus that had come out in the late 50s, that actually set a narrative for how Americans viewed Israel. It lasted for decades. It was so powerful that Edward Said, great Orientalist, he actually blamed it for so much of the policies that America had towards Israel. And we basically need to rebrand what it means to be a Jew in America, and also essentially to rebrand how we view Israel. Otherwise, we're going to be in great, great trouble.
And Len Saxe, ideas of...
So I think of it in this virus metaphor, that we need to develop the equivalent of mRNA vaccines. We need to develop vaccines, ways of approaching it that are specific to particular groups. And the left and the right are different groups. Within the left, they're different groups based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on religion. And I don't think we've been putting enough thought into how to do that. I think on college campuses, those of us who are faculty, we're partly to blame. We didn't educate a generation of students very well, and we didn't engage in them in the kind of intimate debate that my generation of college students was engaged in.
Well, Pam mentioned Exodus, and yes, I think that Exodus set the narrative for some decades. But today, you have to be under 60, I think, to remember Israel as the encircled, imperiled little David surrounded by this Goliath of the Arab states. People have grown up. Your students today have all grown up only knowing Israel as a regional power with a very questionable view of its future relations with the Palestinians. I mean, do you find your students are they just see Israel differently than you do?
Is it to me?
Yes, Len.
Yeah. It's interesting. Students have, I call it nuanced views. The students who know something about Israel, they have empathy for Palestinians. They recognize the difference between Hamas and other Palestinians, but they also have a sense of solidarity with Israel. And I think, unlike Exodus, which presents the heroic version of Israel, and some would say the Hollywoodized version, I think many Jewish students, maybe even the majority of them, have a much more nuanced view. We pay attention to those who do some of the outrageous things that are being done and being said now.
Your students, Pamela, I mean, do they see Israel as you do?
What we know is that students, and also this comes from research of some others from besides Len, we know is that students in certain groups view Israel as equivalent to China and equivalent to Iran, that they see Israel essentially as, you know, among the nations in the world that don't really have a right to exist. And then there are other groups like some of the students that Len was talking about who have a much more nuanced view, but also, you know, are deeply concerned about the injustices. And remember that our students have grown up essentially with a far-right government in Israel. They only know the Israel of this Netanyahu government. And until October 7th, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were also protesting against.
Yes, against Netanyahu. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Frank, you've occasioned a great deal of discussion. I'll let you have the last few seconds to say whatever you'd like to about your article and what you've heard.
I just want to add on. So it's, you know, while some students may hold Israel in the same regard that they hold China or Iran, I don't ever recall them taking over Hamilton Hall to protest the Uyghurs or taking over a campus in order to show solidarity with the Green Revolution in Iran. And so we have to ask, like, what's happening here? And to me, you have to look for some of the deeper explanations that we're saying. At the same time, we have to also, I think, acknowledge that there is real suffering that's happening in Gaza, and that oftentimes the Israelis do themselves no favor by not addressing some of the bigger issues and bigger concerns, and this is going to grow as a problem. And as much as I would love to see Israel, viewed differently in the eyes of young people, letting all of the anti-Semitic, all of the anti-Zionist narratives disappear because there are so many pernicious parts of those narratives. I also wish that there was a movement towards something in Israel that addressed some of their concerns and that wouldn't let them hang on to those threads of evidence that they hang on to that get blown out of proportion and become the basis for this fever that's sweeping over so many campuses.
Well, Frank Foer, Pamela Nadell, and Len Saxe, thanks to all three of you for a very enlightening discussion of this question. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout and Roni Giuliano of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 national charitable organization, which represents in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.